We're excited to we're live now. Thank you so much, everyone, for waiting. We're super excited today to host Deniz Salali, who is an assistant professor of evolutionary anthropology and medicine at UCL. And actually, it's a very interesting way how we got connected through a Royal Society meeting where I was giving a talk about my computational work on collective memory and the experiments we've done in humans on analyzing how conversations in different structures is going to lead to more convergence or more accumulation. And it was a fantastic couple of days of conference. And as a consequence of it, I got to know Deniz, who's going to tell us about her incredible field work and other work that she's done on hunter-gatherers. And I saw your blog posts and very interesting analogies that you had between hunter-gatherer knowledge accumulation and what ML can learn about it. And I was very impressed by it. You've also done some work on COVID, and so it's very cool the breadth of research as well as the focus that you've had on hunter-gatherers. So I'm very excited personally, and I can't wait. I know that John and others are also very excited. So please take it away. Share your screen. We're very excited about this.
Thank you very much, Aida, for the great introduction. Let me share my screen and hope it works. Okay. So you see my presentation?
Yes, and if you go full screen.
Yeah, that's what I'm...
Perfect. Do you mind pressing the hide a little lower? Do you see that hide in the middle of the screen?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Okay, I think it's
Take it away.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm very excited as well. And thank you very much, Aida and John, for inviting me to speak at Learning Salon. First, I will be talking about accumulation of plant knowledge in hunter-gatherers. And then I will continue by talking a bit about social learning in hunter-gatherer childhood. And then finally, I will briefly talk about implications of our findings on cumulative knowledge in hunter-gatherers to AI and also some current issues. So when we look at human evolution, for most of our existence on Earth, we lived by hunting and gathering. And that's why many evolutionary anthropologists like myself are very interested in studying current day hunter-gatherers because some of these populations live still mainly by foraging wild foods. And I have been doing field work in Congo, Brazzaville with Bayaka, or they're also called Mbangele, hunter-gatherers since 2013. And they are one of the many hunter-gatherer groups who live across Central Africa. So first, I would like to briefly talk about life ways of the Bayaka. So the Bayaka live in these traditional huts, and multiple families come together, and they live in these what anthropologists call campsites. And each camp usually consists of 10 to 60 individuals. And people move between camps depending on food resources. So they're mobile hunter-gatherers. And the main subsistence is by hunting wild animals like wild antelopes and also gathering wild foods. And the meat that is hunted is shared with the community. And women gather wild plants, but they also do fishing. And people also exchange agricultural wild foods with agricultural products. As you see in the top right corner in the photo, there is a Bantu farmer who is selling the Bayaka some agricultural products and alcohol in exchange of wild products. So what we see in hunter-gatherer social structure, human social structure, we see this multi-level organization. So here, the triangles depict man and the circles depict woman. And humans have strong pair bonds between man and woman. And families come together, forming forming multi-family groups. You can see these as hunter-gatherer camps. And these camps or these multi-family groups are further connected to other groups through marital ties and through friendly interactions. So human social structure is characterized by this federation of multi-family groups. And many researchers, many anthropologists, including our research group, have suggested that this social structure that we see in hunter-gatherers have facilitated high levels of information exchange. And this has been quite important in the cumulative cultural evolution that we see in humans. So human culture is quite unique because we accumulate knowledge over generations and we build on this knowledge. And in the end, we have such complex cultural traits, for example, artificial intelligence, that no one individual can invent alone. So one of the theories in anthropology is that this social structure facilitated the evolution of cumulative culture, but we didn't have empirical data testing this. And that's why I wanted to look at how hunter-gatherers accumulate knowledge. And specifically, I wanted to focus on accumulation of medicinal plant knowledge because throughout my visits and stays in Bayaka, I realized how important plants are in their lives. And I've also observed that the Bayaka have over 200 plant uses. So they have a vast repertoire of plant uses. And for example, in this photo, you see some preparations of plants, mostly for medicinal purposes. So they don't only use plants for food, but also medicine. And it's quite important because they have very limited access to modern medicine. Throughout my fieldwork, starting from 2013, together with two colleagues, I visited 4 Bayaka camps. And I asked over 200 individuals about 33 plants. I asked them if they knew these plants and if they use these plants. And then, as I said, I was interested in understanding how people share this plant knowledge and in general, how family ties and camp ties, so how social structure that we observe in hunter-gatherers facilitates sharing of plant knowledge. And for this, I looked at pairwise similarity in medicinal plant use. What I mean by this, so for example, if two individuals said that they use the same plant for the same medicinal purpose, then I coded their response as shared, as 1. But if they said that they use the same plant for different medicinal purpose, I coded their response as 0, so not shared knowledge. And then we looked at what factors predicted the odds of shared knowledge. So what factors predicted the pairwise similarity in medicinal plant use between two individuals. And we had variables. So here you see the significant variables that came as a result of our logistic regression and effect sizes. As you could see, if you shared a lot of knowledge, so you had much more similarity of medicinal plant use with your mother, your father, and your sibling, which is not surprising because we know from ethnographies that these plant uses are passed down within families. But what we observed that was quite interesting is that your odds of sharing medicinal plant knowledge increased if you had a relationship, if you had a marital relationship. So you shared a lot of plant knowledge with your husband, and not only with your husband, but with your in-laws, and even with your spouse's distant kin. So based on these findings, what we can say that how we can say the medicinal plant knowledge accumulates in Bayaka hunter-gatherers is that you first learn about plants as you receive care from your parents, from your older siblings, and when you partner up, then your partner brings in the knowledge that they shared within their family, and this way, medicinal plant knowledge accumulates over generations. So we wanted to further this research, and we wanted to look at as well how social networks facilitate accumulation of knowledge in hunter-gatherers. For this, we use these wireless sensors, these devices, to draw social networks in two hunter-gatherer populations, so one with the Bayaka and another hunter-gatherer population in the Philippines. And here on the right-hand side, you see a social network of a camp that I stayed in 2014, a Bayaka camp. And here, each node represents an individual in the network, and the node colors are depicting the households. And red ties are people that are connected through family ties. So they're either biological kin or they're connected. They can be connected through marital ties as well. And the blue ties connect unrelated people. So what you see here in this hunter-gatherer social network is that it's quite similar to a small world network where there are clusters, so the families, and these clusters are further connected with weak ties, with friendship ties. And what we found is that these friendship ties also predicted the odds of sharing plant knowledge. So you also shared quite a lot of knowledge on how to use a plant for medicinal purposes with your friends. Okay, so we know that for accumulation of knowledge, social structure is important, but also transmission of information, transfer of information with high accuracy is important. And for this, humans, like many other social animals, use different social learning strategies. And it's very interesting to analyze social learning strategies in hunter-gatherer children because they don't have formal education. So in this part of my talk, I would like to talk a little bit about social learning in hunter-gatherer children. So hunter-gatherer childhoods are characterized by autonomy, exploration, free exploration, and learning, which is quite self-directed. So unlike Western education, children are quite free to explore and learn by observing and imitating others, especially young infants. So I want to show you a video. I hope you can hear the sound well, about an infant learning through observing and imitating her aunt, who is around 6 years old, and the infant is around 1.5.
Apa mau tapi biar nggak di show.
Okay. And so autonomy and learning through imitating others and self-exploration, as you could see, is very important. And also another characteristic of hunter-gatherer childhoods is that children have wide social networks. So they spend most of their days play in play groups, in mixed-aged play groups. But the difference between work and play is not that obvious, like in our society. So here I want to show you a video of children's foraging trip, where it was the caterpillar season. So children went to forest to forage caterpillars, but they also turn it into play. So they sing for the caterpillars, and the caterpillars fall from the tree, and they collect. Okay, so we use these video recordings that I shot in the field over years to look at how social learning strategies change over development of hunter-gatherer childhoods throughout hunter-gatherer childhood. So what we observe is that for young infants, like the infant that you saw in the first video, they learn mainly by observing and imitating others. And then once children wean, which is around 4 years, then they join playgroups and they learn mainly by practicing in the playgroups and playing with other children. And teaching is quite rare. In every age group, we observed episodes of teaching, but it's quite rare compared to Western societies. But when teaching is important, is that when children cannot observe those information that is easily. So, for example, skills like using knives, it's quite easy. It's quite visual, so you can learn through imitating others. Whereas for information which is more abstract, like social norms, it's more difficult to learn through observation and just imitation. So in those cases, teaching is quite important. And here I want to show you some episodes of what we coded as teaching, where a teenager boy brought hunted meat into the community, and he had to share with other children. And in this case, he was directed by a couple of adults. So he was cutting the animal and now he shares, but it's always under the direction of an adult. The adult doesn't interfere much, but she just gives feedback. Okay. So because I want to have more time for discussion, I'm going to go to the implications of our research on accumulation of knowledge in hunter-gatherers for AI and current issues. So as I mentioned, the Bayaka don't often give direct instructions. So teaching is, even when teaching occurs, which is quite rare, it's done by creating a learning opportunity, like providing tools to children and observing the child. and commenting on or giving feedback to the performance of the child, like in the case of that teenage boy who was sharing meat. So I think that there are many parallels in how hunter-gatherer children learn and recent machine learning algorithms. And many AI researchers believe that reaching artificial general intelligence can be possible through more independent learning strategies. In unsupervised learning, for example, the algorithm doesn't have an explicit guidance or a predetermined goal. And I think this way of learning is quite similar to how hunter-gatherer children learn. And I wrote about some of these parallels and observations a couple of years ago in this blog, and I'm happy to talk about these further and brainstorm. And I think also this self-directed learning and autonomy allows for innovations both in hunter-gatherers and in machine learning. And I think part of the success of these new algorithms like AlphaZero has been because they are not restricted by the accumulated human knowledge. They could go beyond that knowledge through self-play. So autonomy and self-directed learning is important. But actually, what we know that at the core of the success of human cultural evolution lies cooperation and learning from each other. And I've been happy to see that some AI researchers are now moving towards that direction, looking at cooperative AI. And I've been happy to see that there are some convergence in ideas. And both our research on accumulation of knowledge in hunter-gatherers and also recent laboratory experiments have shown that structure of interacting individuals, or in machine learning, you can say that agents, affects accumulation of culture and diversity. For example, what we see in fully connected networks, human networks, the information transfer is very rapid, and there is less chance of a cultural loss, but then there is also less cultural diversity because the group is quite, the cultural traits gets quite homogeneous if information spreads that fast. Whereas when you go towards less connected groups, then you see that the cultural diversity increases in more structured groups, but then this comes at a cost to the possibility of cultural loss. And at intermediate levels of connectedness, you are allowed for both cultural diversity, but also exchange of information. So the implications of this go beyond cultural loss and cultural diversity. So I want to show you here a network, and I don't know if you what you think this network is from. It could be a hunter-gatherer network clustered by medicinal plant use, but it's actually a network drawn using Facebook users. So the users are clustered based on their vaccination decisions. And here you see people, you see red nodes showing people who are against vaccinations, and blue nodes showing people who are pro-vaccinations, and green nodes are undecided individuals. And what these researchers show that people who are undecided, so vaccine hesitant people, cluster more tightly with people who are against vaccinations. And of course, this has implications for vaccine uptake. And not only network topology or like how people connect to each other is important in information transfer, but also who communicates first with whom is important. Like Ida talked briefly about her recent research on this, which I found quite interesting. What they found is that they looked at how communication temporality of the communication affects formation of collective memory, and they found that if people who connect different clusters communicate first, then it facilitates the formation of collective memory, which I think, of course, have implications for emergence of group level behavior that we can discuss further. And finally, the reputation of the person who communicates is also important in social networks. For example, my collaborators and I have been doing some research on the determinants of vaccination decisions throughout the pandemic. And we asked undecided people, people who hesitate about getting the COVID-19 vaccine, about their intentions if they saw an expert scientist getting vaccinated. And this was much more effective at increasing vaccine intention compared to people seeing a politician or an actor getting vaccinated. So we have also these learning biases, which has evolved, which might have been adaptive in the past, which may have implications for current issues as well. Okay, I will leave here. I think I talked already quite a lot, and open for discussions.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So much interesting data. And I feel like, yeah, there's so many opportunities, hopefully, for collaboration in the future, especially given the data that you have. Maybe I will, yeah. So as you can see, there's like claps in the, in the chat also. So I will start by maybe seeing if I can correctly summarize some of the main points that you made, and then before diving into questions. So what I understood, and I absolutely loved, was that there is these hunter-gatherer societies you studied who live in 10 to 60 individual campsites. They hunt and they kind of use agriculture and exchange agricultural and sort of wild products with each other in trade. And the beautiful thing that you showed was that, so first of all, everything is very much based on family structure. So that's how their society is structured. And another thing that you showed is that they use plants also for medicine, and plant medicine knowledge is kind of very much shared in the family. However, when you guys added this kind of wireless attachments to figure out their networks, you learn something about their social learning structures, which I think I might need to ask about that. What was the relationship between their kind of the structure of their network and the outcomes? I think one study that was at this, I don't know if you're a co-author on that or not, the talk that was before me at the conference, they showed that the fact that they don't share, no one person has all of the knowledge, and that different persons have the knowledge, and this allows for accumulation and being able to make accumulation of knowledge and new kind of potions, so to speak, which would be more similar to clustered networks as opposed to an all-to-all connected network. So that's something that I remembered. So maybe you want to comment on that. And the second amazing thing that you showed is how much they play up to age 16, up to age 15, the majority of the time these kids are playing. And the way that they learn is mostly by playing. They're given something from the very young age of 1.5. They're given a knife and somebody just comments on how to use it, which was very interesting. As in, they just go and pretend like they're they know what they're doing, and someone says, hey, do it like this, as opposed to being directly taught. And it was very interesting what you said. And indeed, in both open-ended artificial intelligence and newer approaches, you're totally right that this idea of play, whether it's self-play like AlphaZero that you were showing, or whether it's just more exploration time or self-supervised learning, I think these are very interesting directions. And my favorite kind of obviously connection point is the particular structures of the network and what kind of tasks they kind of afford. So I'm going to, is this a fair summary before I go on to?
Yeah, very, very good summary. Thank you, Aida. And yeah, about your points, I don't know if I can.
Yeah, absolutely. This is an open discussion now. Yeah, definitely. Please go ahead.
Yeah, that point that you made, that not one individual knew all the repertoire, was that, so I asked about 33 different plants, and if they knew, if for everyone, if they knew each plant, and if they knew it, what they used the plant for. And yeah, there were people, especially older people, who knew all the plants, but there wasn't any one individual who said they used all the plants. So that was the point, I think, in the talk that you saw, that although there is this accumulated knowledge, it's not that one individual know all this repertoire. And it's what I think, what people mention when they say cumulative cultural evolution, it's that this is kind of a collective knowledge, and it's very difficult for one individual to share, and that's quite specific to human cultural evolution.
Very cool. For anyone who's watching and doesn't is not sure about which works we're talking about, so there was a slide that Deniz showed where you had networks that were all-to-all connected, and then more structured and less connected, and then like very sparsely connected. Somewhere in the middle, there are networks that have some clusters, but they have enough connectivity across clusters also, so that they create a whole instead of just random clusters that are not connected. And it's interesting that the more connectivity you have, the more you will have convergence. Everybody would agree on something. Everybody would share the same belief or knowledge. And that's very helpful in situations like a pandemic, or when there is like a danger that is, everybody needs to sort of align and do the same thing, or have the same goal. But then there is evolution of culture requires that different chunks or groups of people do different things, and then they combine. Somebody made a wheel, somebody made a cart, you put it together, and then you have somebody else has like an animal, they attach all of it together, and all of a sudden there is a revolution in how people are moving, for instance. And there is a lot of beautiful work by Derricks and Boyd, and that you mentioned across the years, and a very wonderful experiment, Derricks and Boyd in PNAS 2016, that looks at how a partial connectivity helps to solve hierarchical problems. So what was the structure of the network that you found? Like, what were sort of more central families? What was the social roles? Do they have like, does each community have like a leader, or no, it's all like family organized? Are there like influential families? Like, what is the structure with which they work together or move together?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, majority of mobile hunter-gatherers have egalitarian social structure, so there's no leader in the community, and social structure is quite fluid. So yes, people, when, for example, depending on the seasons, people may gather in larger villages with many different families gathering together. But then in some seasons, for example, in February, I was there and it was the dry season. And in the dry season, people go deep in the forest for fishing. And when they do that, then they go usually in smaller family groups, and they make camps in smaller family groups. So it's a bit like, almost like this fusion social organization, but in a more friendly level. So what we see as well in hunter-gatherers is that although they live they move based on family groups. When we looked at, for example, the average level of relatedness within one camp, the average level of relatedness is actually lower than what we see in some other human groups, for example, in farmer groups. And that's mainly because there is equality between sexes in decision making on where to move next or where to have their family. So, for example, sometimes a couple can go live with the husband's family, and sometimes they move and live with the wife's family. And because they have this rule of exogamy, so they can't marry with very related people, this kind of ends up, this gives rise to increased unrelatedness within the camps. And it's quite interesting because, for example, if you're looking at things like human cooperation and evolution of human cooperation, we know that there are some mechanisms that fulfill cooperation. For example, one is kin selection. We know that many social animals and humans, they're more likely to cooperate with close kin. But in humans, we also see that we cooperate with unrelated individuals. And it's interesting to see that this hunter-gatherer social structure where people on average may not be as much related to each other as we thought in the past, perhaps. It's important in terms of our theories on cooperation and also for culture as well.
Very interesting. I think it would be very cool to see if some of our models would capture your data. So it would be awesome to sit down after this at some point and talk about it, like you were suggesting earlier. So I want to mention that somebody in the chat also asked, and it's a good question to maybe address now than later, which is, did your wireless sensors have built-in accelerometers, so that it would be interesting to see the amount of movement that the individuals have and how much they're sitting, they're sedentary, and whether they're observing, playing, teaching, etc., in different activities.
That's a very good question. The wireless sensors didn't have accelerometers, but then my recent work, actually now I've been looking at physical activity levels. So in 2018 and last time in February when I went there, I used these Fitbit-like devices, and we gave quite a few individuals these devices, and we can actually now look at, we're still analyzing, I have a PhD student analyzing that data, and we can look at this, but what we can say from the analysis that we did is that yes, the physical activity levels, especially in children, are quite high. We actually saw that children are more physically active than adults, and they are the activity levels are quite similar to young adults. So, which is quite interesting because in evolutionary medicine, when we look at human biology, we know that if you don't have enough energy resources, if you we live in very abundant environments, and in hunter-gatherers they mostly live in abundant environments, but there may be some days where there is not enough food, and when you're growing up, sometimes your body trades growth with maintenance, for example. So you may want to conserve more energy, but what we see, because growing requires a lot of energy as well, but it's quite interesting to see that hunter-gatherer children are really active. And I also know that from personal experience, because if you want to follow a hunter-gatherer child whole day, you're sure to get really tired at the end of the day.
Thank you. Do they have, do you have any kind of, like you showed us some work that you showed, which was the y-axis was increase in cluster size, and the kind of the x-axis was initial cluster size, and this was for your anti-vaxxers on Facebook. Did you do similar kind of analysis based on changes in cluster size on the hunter-gatherers, or that's like more longitudinal that you don't have yet, longitudinal data that you haven't got yet?
I don't understand which. Is it the Facebook user data?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's not from my data. It's the paper that was published in 2020. So I don't know.
I see. So so it has other authors. I see. So I'm wondering, did you do something similar to yours, like how the cluster sizes might change over time, and what's the relationship between initial clusters? Also, if there are some plant medicine that is useful for a particular disease that only one of the families has, and then that, like, how is those things changing over time in terms of the spread of knowledge depending on what's happening?
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually. But I think, unfortunately, it's the cross-sectional data that we had on social networks. So we gave people to wear these devices for around a week. And I think for that kind of question, you require giving these devices to people for over longer periods of time to see how social networks change depending on the seasonality that I mentioned, for example. But that's logistically more difficult, because then you have to be there, or you can have field assistance perhaps, but also asking people to wear these devices for such a long time, I don't know if it's how feasible that is. Having said that, I haven't looked into that much, but I think we can using the plant knowledge data, because what is also quite interesting is that there are some plants in the data that have very high consensus on what they're used for. So for example, one plant, almost 80% of all the people who I interviewed said that they use it for digestive problems. But then there are some other plants where there's a lot of use variation. Like, for example, only one family would, as you were giving an example, only one family were using that plant for a certain type of illness. So there is a room for looking at why that's the case, and why for some plants. And some researchers say that they use consensus on medicinal plant uses as a proxy for utility. So they say that, okay, if there is a lot of consensus on what one plant is used for, then that may actually be a sign of this plant is actually useful for treating that disease. Which may be the case. It's quite difficult to look into that, but we know that for most of these plant species, there is already in the literature, they've seen some pharmaceutical properties, which I don't go into my research. But what I find more interesting is the cross-species use of the same medicinal plants, because it was quite interesting that some plants that the Bayaka use are also used by chimpanzees and gorillas as medicine. And these were actually the plants that they had higher consensus for, which was quite interesting.
Very interesting. Before going to more questions, I want to give John an opportunity to ask his questions. I'm guessing he will be asking a lot about the synthesis of a lot of this information.
Hi, that was very, very interesting. Yeah, I have a number of questions. I'm trying to sort of, broadly speaking, it seems, that this test bed that you have is like so rich in terms of what you can investigate, right? In other words, it's, and that's my first question is you call them hunter-gatherers, but clearly they've had contact with the non-hunter-gathering world. So how pure a hunter-gatherer group are they? In other words, how contaminated are they by other, cognitive gadgets and non-hunter-gatherer means of living? In other words, when you say hunter-gatherer, until the recent Graeber book, it was always quite a linear Whiggish narrative that hunter-gatherers gave way to, agricultural societies and concentration of surplus and networks which were more concentrated, and that was the story of construction of culture and perpetuation. But it seems to me you're telling a hunter-gatherer version of the construction of cultural products. But my impression was you had to get to the next stage for that to happen. So what am I missing?
Well, if you had to wait till the next stage, that means like only fewer than the last 5% of human existence on Earth. So I don't.
Look, exactly. I'm really not putting an opinion, but the Graeber, and I can't remember the second author's book, was very much about questioning that story. But I'm just saying that, how pure. All I'm asking is how pure a hunter-gatherer society is this? How is it not contaminated by cell phones and other types of information? And so, how do you keep your experiment, if I may say, pure?
Yeah, so what you mean by pure, I think when evolution anthropologists talk about society being hunter-gatherer, is that means that most of their food is coming from hunting and gathering. That's kind of the definition of hunter-gatherer group. And of course, almost no living hunter-gatherers live 100% by foraging for wild foods. For example, the Bayaka, yes, they do subsist mainly on wild foods, but they also sell hunted meat, for example, in exchange of mostly carbohydrates. I would say like manioc flour, for example, is bought a lot. And this is so this is how anthropologists define hunter-gatherer societies. And I guess you're more interested in cultural aspects of hunting-gathering life. In the Bayaka, I don't think there is a very few groups on Earth that are completely isolated. And most of the hunter-gatherers, so again, communities who mainly subsist by hunting and gathering, have contact with their neighboring groups. And for Bayaka, this has been going for thousands of years. They have exchange with farmers. And the group that I work with, most children, they don't go to school. So there is one, I think, aspect that would change our results a lot. That's why I said in my presentation that it's interesting to look at how children learn in these societies, because they don't have formal education. Having said that, there are some Bayaka who live more closer to farmer villages, or who live in logging towns in Congo, and then who go to the local schools there. So it's actually would be an interesting study to compare learning in these children and in children who live more far away from villages and more in the forest, and how they learn.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because I'm just trying to, get a sense what unique questions about learning, communication, cultural production can be asked by looking at, let's say, children in a fairly pure hunter-gathering situation where they're not going to school and not just talking to farmers. I guess my question is, is what unique questions of general scientific consequence does this rare opportunity provide? In other words, I just want you to get a sense of, you know, if I were to just go to my local school and study kids and, you know, in other words, I guess I just like a better sense of what uniquely is being asked here about humans, because you've got them in this relatively pure hunter-gatherer context. What can you learn here that we could not learn studying humans and children on a farm or in a village? That's what and I don't mean it, I promise you, at all polemically. I'm just trying to get a sense of what does this, you know, unique opportunity does this provide? Is it to sort of imagine what happened in the progression to agricultural society in city-states? Is it just easier to control certain variables? I'm just trying to understand what the unique opportunity is here.
Yeah, your question is very good. I think I mentioned this before, but I think the most unique opportunity, or what is more interesting, is that there is no formal education. So it's quite a very different childhood environment. Of course, I'm not saying this is a unique community. There are many other communities across the world, and I think we should be studying, or we should be learning about learning from these communities as well, rather than just focusing on learning in Western children. I think that would be my point.
Mm-hmm. Because not having a formal education absolutely is kind of interesting. It strips away something that, in a sense, can contaminate and confound certain questions. I see your point. But also, I think sometimes, because there's been such an emphasis on the word hunter and gatherer, I think people think, foraging theory. And, you know, as you know, foraging is a massive area of interest to, you know, neuroscientists, computational neuroscientists. And so it seems a little bit like a red herring, in so much that this wasn't really about optimization theory of foraging, as so much that it was more about ways that learning can happen outside the context of formal education, imitation, emulation, play. It didn't seem to me that this was about foraging per se, right? In other words, when do you exploit, when do you explore, and that whole framework that has been developed. It doesn't quite feel foragey to me, your talk.
I see. What would you do to make it, like, what would you be interested in?
Oh, I have no particular, I mean, I find it all interesting, quite honestly. There are so many things I want to ask you about. I just feel like, you know, studying what happens in the absence of formal education seems to be a slightly different story than hunter-gathering that just felt more about foraging.
No, actually, John, I disagree that hunter-gatherer are just about foraging. Because I've seen a lot of research that also Deniz was mentioning earlier. One of the most important things is you can see how cultural evolution happens in situation, or cultural accumulation happens, hierarchical innovation happens in kind of a society where people are not texting or don't have access to Wi-Fi or don't have other things. So you can look at their network of their interactions, how people communicate, what kind of social structures they have, how the structure of particular of those communities leads to particular levels of innovation versus others, how the sharing of plant knowledge happens in particular structures of the graph connectivity versus others. And these are some of the things that, for instance, folks write about with regards to hunter-gatherer societies.
Yeah, right.
A lot of it is about, sorry, let me finish. A lot of it is about collective knowledge and collective learning. I think it's super interesting also this aspect of how the children learn as well. So it seems like for surviving in hunter-gatherer societies, what is the kind of learning they use? And that's a lot of play-based learning, for instance, right? With like minor supervision. So I think that all of these are very interesting. And the term hunter-gatherer simply refers to the fact that they don't live within the kind of globalized framework of 9-to-5 jobs and schools, right? And communication schemes. So I don't think that hunter-gatherer, at least for me, it doesn't mean foraging. It never has in that sense. So I'd love it if you can clarify where the claim that hunter-gatherers
I
should
never
be.
made that claim. I think that in fact, I mean, what was the title? Wasn't foraging in the title?
But I mean, you can also look at, if you're
I mean,
interested.
I'm just wondering. I thought there was something about foraging. Maybe
Well, the hunter-gatherers do foraging, but that
right.
doesn't.
But foraging has. All I'm saying is all I was saying is that there's a whole field of optimization theory
Sure.
about foraging, and all I'm saying is that's not something. And again, I don't mean it critically. I'm just saying that there are, and as you said, and I just said, there are other aspects of fascination under the umbrella of what uniquely happens in hunter-gatherer societies that doesn't just boil down to seeing if humans optimize foraging strategies, right? That was all I was getting at.
I
right?
see. You're saying it in a positive way. You're saying,
I was just, that's what I was asking about. That I think that was just one aspect of it, and then the other thing, play is so fascinating, right? In other words, play. One of the main ideas of play, of sort of Homo ludens, is that you're enjoying yourself unaware that there are going to be benefits, right? In other words, play is almost a little bit like sex is enjoyable, but really it's there for reproduction. Play is enjoyable, really it's there to learn how to be a killer or a hunter or whatever it is, right? So there's this sort of proximal distal argument that's been used a great deal, that, same thing with, take your medicine, we'll make it strawberry flavored, right? It's not enough to be told it's good for you. At least if you're a child, it has to taste good, right? So it seems to happen a lot, right? Sex is fun and it's reproduction. Play is fun and it gets you ready for hunting, blah, 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 right? So given that play has this cognitive, aesthetic, almost sport-like feel, I find it kind of surprising you say it's exactly what machine learning does. I mean, machines are totally devoid of any emotion or play. AlphaGo wasn't happy that it won, right? Yes, you can say it's playing a game, but that's a sort of semantic borrowing. So given how important play is with all its richness, why are you saying that? I mean, I don't think there's any evidence at all that machines are actually playing in the sense that children are playing. So I was just wondering whether that parallel, and I haven't read your article in Scientific American, isn't spilling over into the notion of play that seems to be such an important part of your story.
I wasn't really making parallels between play and machine learning. I was more making parallels between how learning in hunter-gatherer childhood is quite self-directed. So there is not someone giving them instructions. For example, no adult would tell a group of hunter-gatherer children, okay, now go for fishing. We don't want you in the camp, right? They just they are like autonomous entities, children groups, and they decide for themselves that they would want to go for fishing. And they usually merge. What I was saying about play is that we have this really distinct notion of play versus work. For example, in human childhood, right, like in Western education, you do your homework and then you play. Whereas what I was saying is that in hunter-gatherer growing up, this is not the case. You would see foraging for fishing or catching or getting caterpillars in the forest. Maybe we would see it as work, but they also see it as play. The analogy that I was making is that it's the more autonomous way of learning in hunter-gatherer childhood and this new machine learning
Right. So in other words, you were basically just making a parallel between play as a form of unsupervised learning, and
Exactly.
I mean, frankly, my personal view is there's something far more cognitively interesting and far more complex going on when children play than what large language models are doing in unsupervised learning. So in other words, I think it's a very generous statement to machines. I mean, and I think that, quite frankly, I'm a fan of, people like Spelke and Carey and others who have basically been teaching us how important it is to have a look at infants playing in any context and how much that's going to teach us about cognition. And I'm just a little bit wary that large language models, which are largely unsupervised, obviously, should be given that much cred compared to the extraordinary thing that's going on when children play and learn unsupervised. I wonder whether that's more not literally true of the similarity. It's more kind of analogy that's actually being made here. And I was just wondering, you meant it more metaphorically than you did literally.
Can I just maybe for 1 second do a translation between disciplines? So John, for instance, mentioned Elizabeth Spelke, who's a developmental psychologist. You're an evolutionary anthropologist. Are you aware of her work? I mean,
yeah, I know.
Okay, good. So there, one idea is to have, to study either her ideas of core knowledge, play, etc. There are these ideas that are more the methodology of psychology. The foraging work that John also mentioned, it's done in rodents and in humans, especially neuroscientists like to see what Locus coeruleus does when it comes to foraging in one patch and then going to another patch, for instance, in rodents. And in humans, you can think about it in terms of farmers, but you can also think about it in terms of different tasks that you do or different websites that you go to, and when do you sort of switch between them. Sometimes it could be that you depleted some source, or it could be that you got bored of it. There are various things. So there's a lot of theory there. But the methodology of these approaches is the methodology of psychology and neuroscience, which is obviously a different approach of learning something than, for instance, maybe your approach. And so, John, maybe there is a kind of like, I don't know, I feel like there is an interesting thing that is happening in front of me, which is John is coming from that, bringing questions from that discipline, which is beautiful. And so please go ahead and let us know. But I just want to mention in this, before you go ahead and let us know your answer, I'd like to mention this distinction that John mentioned, whether it's literal or whether it's a sort of an analogy or some metaphor. I think you're right that Deniz is being too kind to machines, as if the machine learning is advanced enough to capture play. It's not, definitely. The way that in many machine learning approaches, people cite work from play in children and how important play is usually to argue that actually machines need more play-like learning mechanisms, as opposed to like giving them all the labels, right? So before Deniz mentions, like, just want to mention that there are sometimes some things that we might say that might reveal our disciplinary kind of focus. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that we can't extract that information from your data. Probably we can, but that would be a different method. So obviously it's not that we're expecting you to have done all the psychology work on this data. So minor footnote, I took too long to explain. Go ahead, please.
No, thanks. It's just I'm not too sure. I don't think I meant that by, like, the analogy wasn't really between play. I, of course, don't expect like learning algorithms to have that kind of playful character at the moment. But what I was quite interested of course, it's my limited knowledge of machine learning, but I try to read quite a lot of blogs and some papers and to listen to podcasts, is that the direction they're going towards, like using unsupervised learning, reinforcement learning, And I think it's quite similar to actually how children learn in the absence of formal education. And I think there is a value to that. And the value is that they are not entirely based on human knowledge in that way. I think language models are quite different because they look at, as far as I understand, they look at the they have vast search spaces, and they look at they like human language data, which is, I think, which is not the analogy that I'm using really. I'm more talking about AlphaGo or AlphaZero algorithms, where it's mostly about where the machine learns through playing by itself and gets feedback through its performance. And I think there is a beauty in that, is because it's not entirely based on human play, which is quite restrictive. There's this concept of evolutionary constraints, which we can adapt to cultural evolution as well. Yes, human cultural evolution is very unique, and it's amazing, but at the same time it's restricted because it's restricted by the knowledge that has come before, right? And what I'm maybe what I've been excited about this new algorithms is that perhaps they have the ability to surpass some of these, avoid some of these restrictions that we have, because we rely on the knowledge that came before us. I don't know if it makes sense.
No. I do follow. I wanted to. That actually segues into sort of my final sort of questions, really, which is about this cumulative knowledge idea. So I was trying to catch in your talk how the metric for the knowledge accumulating. In other words, presumably you grow your knowledge plant by plant until you begin to have this sort of forest encyclopedia of plants. I didn't catch how the cumulative part happens in your story and in your work. In other words, where is it logged? Where does so generation 2 set of children now know the new stuff, or not children? The hunter-gatherers they discover plants numbers 41 and 42, but plants 1 to 40 have already been discovered. Where is that logged? Where's the cumulative stuff happening? Is it written down? Is it in stories? I couldn't catch where the accumulation physically is happening in your story.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think where the accumulation happens is most of the time when someone gets sick. So when someone gets sick, someone else prepares some medicine for this person.
And where do they look it up?
What are they looking at?
Where is it? Where's the knowledge?
In different people's heads.
So it's never. So in other words, just so I understand, there's cross-generational increase in the number of plants that people know about. How is that actually shown?
And combinations, because they also make combination of different plants, as far as I remember, at least in the other talk. They sometimes combine different plants to create a hierarchical solution, so to speak.
Sure, but where are they? I mean, I look it up, right? I look up dosing of medicines. I read about them. I'm just wondering, in this hunter-gatherer version, where is so in other words, how does it cross generations, the knowledge?
So
let's say you know about 40 plants and 50 plants, 100 plants. How does it accumulate over time if there isn't sort of texts and books? And where is it?
So basically what you're asking is how human culture accumulates pre-invention of writing. Right? Is that
yes, I suppose I am. I was just, I found it so interesting when you talked about, I was thinking about the kernels of cumulative knowledge, and So yes, where's the accumulation happening if there's no writing? How's it happening?
It's through demonstration, through verbal passing on the knowledge. Of course, there are stories, but for plant knowledge per se, I don't think there are stories based on, maybe there are, how they use plants. But you don't necessarily, of course, writing is a great has been a great human invention, because it actually increased the acceleration of cultural evolution, like internet. But it doesn't mean that we need writing for, or we needed writing for culture to evolve, I think.
So yeah, I it must be true. I'm just being very concrete here. You know, is it just somebody with an amazing memory, and each generation just know? I'm just wanting to know where let's say there are 200 plants of medicinal value in the forest, and you saturate. You've worked out the 200, and there's not much else left. Where is that knowledge of 200 in generation Z when it was just knowledge of 50 in generation X? Where's that knowledge now stored in generation Y that has 200? I'm just wondering from your work, where do you think that 200 plants, where is it stored, that knowledge?
But this is what I think we call collective memory, right? It's not stored in one individual's memory, but it's collective knowledge.
Let me clarify this. So John is thinking, where is the knowledge? Meaning you could potentially say, oh, 20 of the plants are in family A, and members of the family are responsible for remembering 20 of the plants.
Right,
Family B has 50 of the plants. Family C has 10 of them. And therefore, there is the human community, the human network is storing knowledge, as far as I understand, John.
Yeah.
And different clusters, which are clustered by families, might be more robust to protecting particular plant knowledge, because the other ones they might hear from their friends, but the ones that they get from the two sides of their families, they're sharing. And because the generations marry each other, because they can't marry within, and because the population is small, that's why I was asking, how can we trace the evolution of the network over time, right? Or the changing of the clusters. So for instance, you can imagine that the physical memory is the different people. There is no one person that has all the knowledge. There is no one family that has all the knowledge. Different families have different ones. And as new problems emerge, new solutions might emerge based on the combinations that happen either by accident or by two families joining and then sharing knowledge and then mixing their potions.
So Ida has exactly, I mean, Ida's, you know, I suppose we know each other very well now. That's exactly kind of what I was asking. And, you know, Ida's given a potential mechanism, basically. But what I was asking is, what is the mechanism? In other words, what has been discovered? Ida's made a sense that some families more robustly cluster a certain set and another family, and through marriage that remains, so you don't lose, it doesn't evaporate, it doesn't dissipate. Is that what happens? How is it accumulated? Is it along the lines that Ida described? Do we have empirical data to verify the very plausible sounding model that Ida suggested?
Well, we have empirical data, these like which families know what plants based on this restricted number of plants that I choose in my data. But I think your question perhaps requires more longitudinal research, right? So you want to see how, for example, from one generation to the next generation, these knowledge repertoires within families change, which we don't have.
How it accumulates, basically. In other words, you know, that.
Yeah, how it accumulates, but it may also, some plant users may also get lost, you know, it doesn't always necessarily have to be accumulating.
But that's a nice thing about culture, right? With writing, as you were suggesting, it is like a one-way ratchet, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Basically, you don't forget across generations, you just keep adding. Now, that's not completely true, right? In other words, there are very interesting ideas where certain skills get lost forever, actually. But right, so I guess it would be nice to know how effective the ratchet is in the absence of writing, right? And I guess that's one of the unique questions that could be asked in a hunter-gatherer situation, is how leaky is the integrator, right? When you don't have writing, right?
Right. And the nice thing is, John, here, the integrator is the entire human network as opposed to one part of one person's brain, as we do it in neuroscience, which is very cool also.
Yeah, right. So, yeah, it seems to me that that was one of the very interesting things that you were suggesting, which is that you can take a look at an integrator in the absence of writing.
Right? Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And of course, stories have historically played an important role, especially in these communities where there is no writing. And it would be quite also interesting to look at what kind of stories are still being passed on, because I know that it's not in many cultures like Bayaka, storytelling has been disappearing. So
is that right? Is that right? And why is that, do you think? Is that because of alternatives, or?
Perhaps, yeah, because of course, as we know, culture is not stable, right? And for example, Bayaka songs, like young generations listen to songs like from Bantu populations as well, like songs that are popular throughout Congo, for example, reach to even the forest, because Bantu, the traders, farmers who trade with hunter-gatherers, they sometimes carry radios with them.
Right.
So younger people like to listen to these kind of like not new music, but popular music in Congo, which is quite usual. I think cultures change. You can't expect cultures to remain stable. But I think interesting question is why, if, for example, some cultural traits in these populations are more resilient, why is that? Why some cultural traits are more like weaker are more readily exchanged with others, whereas some others not that much? That would be, I think, good question to look at.
And my last provocative question, which is exactly on the basis of what you just said, which is, given that it's a non-written version, I can't buy the hunter-gatherer guidebook and become a hunter-gatherer, right? And go, I'm gonna, you know what, the hell with horrible Western civilization, I've had it, I am going to become a hunter-gatherer, and I'm gonna get my hunter-gathering made simple, and I'm gonna read it. Doesn't exist. So do you think that if you don't have a childhood and learn the way you've just beautifully described it, is there any hope for a farmer living on the outskirts to have a hunter-gatherer life in the absence of cheating and reading and writing? In other words, is it something you have to acquire as a child?
I do think that, yeah, it's, especially in an environment like that, you would need to spend, like you would need to spend your childhood in that environment to be able to really survive in that environment, because it's actually quite difficult. Like, it's a swamp forest. You even need to know how to walk properly in the forest, because you can sink. So yes, I think you need to really grow up in that environment. Having said that, there are farmers again, like, who trade with hunter-gatherers, and sometimes they go to forest with them. For example, in the fishing season last time in February, there was a farmer woman who stayed with hunter-gatherers deep in the forest. But if she brought her child, how much the child would be successful in the forest would depend how much I think that child spent time in the forest with other children. Again.
Yeah, you know, it's a great, you know, I'll finish just by, you know, there was this famous, you know, tragic event, right, in the mid-19th century when the Franklin exhibit went to the exhibition went to the Arctic to find the Northwest Passage. And the Erebus and the Terror, the two scientific ships, were lost with all their crew, and everyone died. And then much later, in the 1940s, remnants of the ships and bones were found, and there was evidence for cannibalism, right? And one of the points that got made, and there were records found, I believe, was that all this time when they were starving to death and freezing to death and eating each other, Eskimo families were just living their lives right next door, right? And the question sort of was, why didn't they go and ask the Eskimos? And interestingly, one example was that they believed that the Eskimos were primitive and had nothing to teach, even though they could do exactly like you're saying. They could survive very well in those conditions. And all these people coming from Britain and their scientific ships and all their knowledge, and they couldn't survive in that landscape. So what's so interesting is this notion that there are some kinds of knowledge that you have to acquire over a lifetime tacitly. And if they're not written down, they can't be communicated well. And most importantly, they can't suddenly be acquired from general principles. You actually have to live in those environments, right? And that's just very profound if that turns out to be true.
Yeah, exactly. That's a very beautiful example. And I think that's also why hunter-gatherer childhoods are, when you look at it, that's why there's so much emphasis on autonomy, because they need to be able to, it's harsh environment. Of course, when you see them foraging, it seems like it's so easy, but when you actually try to do it yourself, I can't even walk properly in the forest. Like the last time I was sinking in the mud, so women had to give me some sticks, and I was like an old woman, like trying to walk in the forest. So I think one of the reasons why they let children from very young ages to learn by just observing and like practicing is because they need to do that. If you don't learn by practicing these skills from early ages, then I think your chance of survival is not
right. So what's so unbelievably fascinating, and you know, this is what I was really thinking, is that to be a hunter-gatherer, in any member of a hunter-gatherer group, life is a skill, right? And what I think is really interesting, actually, my brother's written a little about this, is that there's a kind of, and the Franklin expedition is sort of an example of a kind of de-skilling, where you can actually, through cultural transmission, ironically, live your life without having any particular skill of your own, other than having information available to you from others, so you can have an unskilled life, right? And maybe that's the downside of cultural transmission with writing and texting, is that you can be unskilled and get by. Whereas what you're saying, which is so interesting, is that being a hunter-gatherer is a lifelong practiced skill, right? And that's what makes it so interesting compared to the de-skilling of modern life, right?
Yeah, exactly. I totally agree. We rely so much on now accumulated knowledge that we're basically skillless. I mean, when I think about myself, especially after like staying with these communities and coming back to Western life, I just felt like if they saw me sitting all day and just typing in front of this weird device, I wonder what they think about my life.
No, I it's just, you know, I just want you know, I just hope, you know, we do this, the conversations go this way. I just want you to know that having been somebody who's lifelong interested in practice and skill and tacit knowledge, and that you really got me thinking that there's something kind of lost that even though we think we're superior at cumulative knowledge, in a way, we've also lost something.
Yeah, certainly. I think that's the case. Yeah. But I want to add something about like what I said about teaching, because I don't want to give false impressions. Like I'm not, for example, arguing that we don't need teaching. I think what happens throughout human evolution, like or cultural evolution, is that because information got so abstract now, like for example, like mathematics or physics, it's almost impossible to learn those skills by just observing someone. So for these kind of skills, I think you do need like teaching, and maybe then it makes sense to have one person teaching to 50 people, like kind of classroom teaching. But I do think that it's still very important, and what we can learn from hunter-gatherer children is the practice side of it. Like I think Western education is too much dependent on these kind of one-way teaching where there is not much practice anymore.
No, it's really, look, honestly, I as usual, I could talk to you forever. It's so interesting, but I will stop there. But thank you very much for the work.
Thank you, John. I also want to say, with regards to some things that you guys were talking about a little earlier, there is beautiful work, famous work, Paget and Christopher Ansel in 1993. And what they did, the title is Robust Action on the Rise of the Medici, 1400 to 1434. So they look at the changes in the family structure, because John, as you know, the Medici were extremely powerful in Florence. Yes. However, they were not the richest, they were not the biggest, they were not the baddest. And so historically, these folks used graph theory analysis on the structures of the different influential families in Florence to figure out what happened with the Medici. And what they found was that since 1400 to 1434, they started marrying into all the richest, biggest, baddest families. And so their eigenvector centrality increased so much that they became the most eigenvector central, meaning, or eigencentral, meaning the most influential family, even though not the highest connections, not the highest amount of wealth, but highest amount of connectivity to the most influential other families. And so, John, that's the one of the reasons that Deniz and I initially thought about, like, potentially one day kind of collaborating, because the things that I was saying earlier, based on what she had said, is it comes very easily based on a simulation. Like, I can write it very quickly in a simple Python code and just make the figures of how we would hypothesize the knowledge to be contained within this. So, John, imagine that we treat sort of the different families, or the different people in the families, the way that we treat maybe different concepts in somebody's knowledge. Like, there's a little bit of analogy work to make it analogous to studying one brain or one individual. But at the end of the day, the methods are similar. One can look at the structure, the graph structure. Mm-hmm. One can measure the connectivity of individuals, the connectivity of a cluster, which is the family, and the change of that over time if you have access to which other family they married into. For instance, I saw that, Deniz, when you were showing our family structures, some of the families were polygamous, and some of them were not polygamous. Some of them had like one triangle and multiple circles, and some didn't. So those families would have a little bit more knowledge, because as I saw division between the men and women, it seems like women were the carriers of the plant knowledge more, or something, like based on what you were showing. It was like a plot that you showed. If you could maybe show your slides, because that's very...
You mean that plot where men were triangles and women were circles?
I'm comparing that to a plot you had that was called Development of Social Learning in Hunter-Gatherers. Oh, no, not that one. There was another plot that you showed us later, where it was how often... oh, yeah, the one that was all orange, but from your 2016 current biology paper. Percent increase in the odds of shared knowledge, and maybe that answers some of John's question as well. where it turns out like 51%, 56, 57 out of your, like 57% was from the mother, 61% was husband and wife. And these were the highest. The highest were the from mother or from husband and wife. Then it was sibling and primary kin of spouse, right? So it seems like if somebody had, so that's why I mentioned women, because mother seems, father was 28, mother was 57. It seemed like mothers were playing a much bigger role in transferring shared knowledge of medicinal plants.
Yeah, that's true. So they were odds, odds based on odds ratio. So how much more increase you had in the odds of sharing plant knowledge. So the highest effect size was if between spouses, which was quite interesting, because I thought when I was looking at the data, I thought it would be mother and child. So people mostly shared that knowledge with their mothers, but actually spouses shared a lot of knowledge.
But it was close. It was 57 versus 61. They were the highest. And the one after that was a huge drop, which was around 40%. So it's like these two were the closest, highest ones.
Exactly.
And father was 28%. All of a sudden,
to your point, Deniz, you know that if they were to come to the West, they'd see spouses sitting in restaurants saying nothing to each other, right? You see that? You know, people who've been together a long, long time and they're in their restaurants and they say nothing. And there they could be exchanging valuable plant knowledge with each other, right?
I think that's big. That's actually based on probably, although then I guess you need to explain why father is lower in that case. But I thought that the mechanism there is about childcare. I actually think that cooperative care of children that we see in hunter-gatherers and like human societies in general, which is quite a big future of human evolution, because if we didn't have cooperative childcare, probably we wouldn't, the family sizes in humans would have been smaller, because that allowed women to look after multiple babies. But I think cooperative care of children is kind of a proximate mechanism that that leads to this exchange of information about plant uses, because usually when a child is sick, then the caregivers look after them. And I think that caregivers may be learning from each other as they give care to children.
So you're saying that the cooperative child rearing relates to sharing plant knowledge together?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, I mean, we haven't tested that exactly with data, but I would like, that's something I want to look into more.
Very cool. And related to John's point, John, when they have a nanny, then they don't need to share knowledge. When there's daycare, they can go and sit in a restaurant and not talk. Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
That explains it. When you see them saying nothing to each other, they must have a nanny.
Or schools.
Yeah,
schools are made for spouses not to share plant knowledge for each other. Now we know. So let me share some of the questions from the audience, and I don't know if we don't have a lot of questions, so we should be able to let you go very soon. So also I'm inviting Montreal, if he's still around, to ask his question. So one question that was very interesting, and the question was by David. He asks, given that dozens or even hundreds of facts about plants must be learned, apparently play is a driving force of the learning, can they learn taxonomic relations of some form, either for the it got plussed, either for the plants themselves or their functions, or do they learn a mere list or association? And are there some organizing principles? So basically, if you try to, which is a very interesting question, because some of us study the structure of knowledge. And in many of our studies, we basically give pairs to people, but then there is a relationship among the pairs, a bigger relationship among the pairs that the person might need to learn. So I wonder whether they have an idea, even though they might not know all the plants, whether they know something about the relationship between the different plants. Maybe based on relationship between different families. Like I would know if I want something to do with burn medicine, maybe I should go to that family. And if it's about hiccup medicine, maybe it's another family, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a very good question about like who they go to for healing. So they have actually healers, not in every community, but there are some people who are known as being more knowledgeable about plants. And I think if someone can't solve an illness within the family, then they go to that healer.
And then the taxonomy or the structure of the plant knowledge.
That's a very good question. It's like about folk biology. So how people perhaps structure that kind of knowledge with each other. I haven't looked at it, like I haven't done a study on it, but I think from my observations, because they're excellent observers of the forest. They have to be, they know the season, like they know how trees change by seasons, and when there's caterpillar season, which trees to look for caterpillars. So I think these kind of ecological connections, they may be observing these for perhaps categorizing different trees. Perhaps they would be categorizing based on species interactions. It's just an idea that I think maybe.
Oh, very interesting. So you're saying, oh, wow. So you're saying the structure of their knowledge might be informed by the other species interacting with the plant they have a knowledge of?
Yeah, because I know that, for example, when I was asking questions, there were quite a lot of occasions. One, for example, I would say, I'm just making up, Imbema, do you know this plant? And they would say, yeah, it's the plant, this particular type of honeybee, because there are different honeybees in the forest. They would say, this is the plant that that particular type of honeybee go to for making honey. So they have these kind of association, like ecological associations based on observations of different.
What about the relationship between different plants?
You mean
are there structure in some way, either functionally, like these are for burns, this is for digestion, this is for something else? Like, is there like some kind of categorization or structure to the whole thing?
That's a very good question. That is actually, that's what I did to analyze this data. I kind of restructured their answers based on our, like we say, digestive. This is digestive system disorder. This is respiratory. I had to do that to be able to analyze the data. But for them, I'm guessing that this would be more based on the ecology, because some plants, and most of these plants were trees. Some trees they grow more closer to the streams, whereas some trees grow by the roads. So I think it's just my guess that they may structure plants based on where they grow in the forest, because they are quite knowledgeable at as well where you would find a certain type of tree in the forest. For example, in February, the forest camp that we stayed in was called Imbema, and they told me they named the camp with this name because it's the name of a tree, and there is that tree near that camp. So that's how they named the campsite.
Very interesting. So the spatial location and interaction with an association with a particular animal, or which are both ecological ways of structuring. Those are the things that you were.
I think so. Yeah.
Very cool. And I before, sorry to make you wait, Montreal. One more question that is related, follow up. And I had the same, and Mihai asked the same. So I hope it's okay to ask that before Montreal. Do they have a religion and religious rituals, and what role do plants play in those rituals? Because I'm from Iran, you're from Turkey. Our countries very much use plant medicine and various kinds of teas and, smoking herbs in order to like, cleanse the space. I wonder really whether they also have those kinds of approaches and how much it's related to their religious belief. And if there are religious beliefs, are they learned by, I guess, verbally, because you can't learn it by play? And do they have like ceremonies, which would be a little bit closer to organized teachings or such?
Yeah, actually, these are very good questions. I now regretted that I didn't show the videos about the rituals. I had those videos.
Oh, please do. We are open to show if you show it now.
Let's see. I may have it on my slides. Oh yeah, I have actually. Let me share my screen again and show, and then I will explain. So I'm gonna show first adult, like very small scene from adults forest spirit ritual, and then I'm gonna show a imitation of that ritual by children, and it's kind of a play imitation. There you can see it's like everything is what we would call play, but it's actually they're imitating adults' rituals in their play, children. So let me share.
That's interesting. So they didn't get told what these are, they just observed others do it.
Yeah, because when adults are doing these rituals, children are always around. They sometimes fall asleep, which is quite interesting to me because it's very loud. Women sing very loudly, but children just lay there and fall asleep at night because these rituals go all night often. So it's, and then children also participate. For example, usually, so women sing and call these forest spirits from the forest, and men who are believed to capture these spirits in the forest, they then come to the camp dressed in leaves. So they use specific leaves to dress themselves for these ritual ceremonies. And before women start singing, it's usually children who start singing. So they both learn, but they again learn by doing it, by practicing this. So let me show.
Or also maybe you can let us know what the role of plants is in these rituals.
Yeah, in this specific one, it's the man, you will see the plants are used as like a decoration. You will see now. So this was this goes on for whole night, and the women do this what musicians call polyphonic singing, because many women sing in different notes. And now I'm going to show the children version of this forest spirit ritual. So one thing is that there are, of course, there are some religious rules in that that women can, as a woman, you can't touch the forest spirits, and that's what, like, when children were, so the boy who was acting as a forest spirit in the middle, the girls were getting closer to him, but not so close that they wouldn't touch him, because if they touch, they believe that they would die. You can't touch the forest spirits. So they kind of turn this into a play as well. But then women do that in the rituals too. They kind of dance with the forest spirits, but then they can't go too close. And the other question about uses of more general uses of plants for other types of rituals. I wouldn't say it's ritual, but for some social norms, there are some plants that they use to detect cheaters. For example, if someone is being accused of cheating their partner, then I think there are these poisonous plants. So they often use barks. So they get the bark and then they boil it and they ask the person who's accused of cheating to drink it. And they believe that if the person survives, then he's not guilty. But if he dies, then he was guilty. So, and I think this is not only when I did this research, it was quite interesting to me. But then when I looked at literature, this happens in some other African countries as well. These poisonous ordeals.
That's
Yeah.
interesting. So, John, I don't know if you noticed that. So, plants are also used for punishments, basically, of sorts. Oh, John, it's you're muted.
I was laughing at the idea of poisoning a cheetah. You know, but seems a bit drastic.
And it's trial by fire. They say if you survive, then you weren't cheating or something. Does anybody survive?
Well,
I don't know, because to be honest, I haven't seen anyone doing it when I was there. But there was a lot of consensus on that plant as well. Because when I asked about that particular plant, most people said that they use it to detect cheaters, which was quite interesting.
it's a little bit like when they used to sort of douse witches, that if you drowned, you weren't a witch. Not particularly reassuring, right? But listen, Deniz, I have to go. I have to go host a party.
Wait. Let Montreal
you.
ask his question
Super.
first, because Montreal has the screen. Go ahead.
Okay, Montreal, are you there?
Sorry, we can't hear you.
Yeah.
Oops. Hello. We can't hear you yet. I think it's your
We can't hear
headphones,
you.
Montreal. So maybe you want to. I don't know if it's going to work without them. We still can't hear you. Oh, okay. I can read your question then. Wait, say again.
Montreal. Stop showing off. Anyway, I'm going.
So wait a second. So he was asking if there is some insight in triadic relationships and variables that there is some congruency, add some congruency or strengths, and how important are the different structures of smaller multi-person relationships in acquiring of skills in the social context.
Can you repeat the first part of the question? I couldn't really.
I think he says, is there insight to be found in triadic relationships? And how they might contribute to, I don't know what he means by congruency and strength, but that's why I wanted him to ask his question. I wanted to make sure his question gets asked. I'll re-invite you, Montreal, just to make sure.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at triadic relate. Of course, yeah, it would be. I mean, any type of, because we're interested in.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Awesome. Great. So actually, I wanted to ask first. I actually listened to your discussion. I think my question may be slightly off base. I was under the impression that you were interested in how sort of societies developed in a way, and hunter-gatherer groups were just more or less kind of a starting point because it's less, I don't want to say developed or complex, but they have these sort of, you can identify them and the way in which they interact with each other. So just to like read the question, it was whether or not So there's this idea of like tridiatric relationships and a different sort of strength and connection or congruency even. So I'm agent A and B, and we have congruent behaviors, but they may not be the same as agent C's behavior. So like a lot of in groups have high congruency and high strength in their interactions. And I was wondering if maybe you could sort of make a prediction about diffusion of a skill, or how likely a skill is to be transferred to maybe some agent outside of this thing, and would that matter? So I have a tridiatric relationship. The connections are either really high or low, or some variability in it. And then I have an outside agent, and I want to know what's the possibility that they could learn whatever skill is it within that tridiatric. I know that's like convoluted.
So just to make sure, you mean like an out group member, like a person who's not from the community?
Or even just like not as close to the three, yeah. Like can I find some principles about how social learning helps to develop, and is this a way to do that?
You mean like if people are open, how open is social learning opportunities to, for example, people who are not within that family? Am I understanding correctly? Is it?
Sorry, yeah, that's the possible. So I don't know, maybe so I have a knowledge of what one plant does, and it's between me, my wife, and my kid, and our relationship's all strong. And then my kid makes a friend. So what's the possibility that that friend will also acquire that knowledge? And does it depend on how close we are?
I think that's a very good question, and I think that it's really domain specific how much information is shared. So for plant knowledge, we know that it's mostly shared within families. It's almost like more secret kind of knowledge. Whereas for some other types of plant uses, for example, the plant use that I mentioned about detecting cheaters that's used for punishment, this is more open to public. And we also saw that for plant uses that are related with foraging, because there are some plants that people use for catching fish as poison or catching monkeys. And we saw that there is a lot of consensus among the camp members on how for what reason that plant is used for. So I think that it's for domains that are more public, within the more public sphere, like for foraging, for example, or for social norms. These knowledge is much more easily acquired by kind of further connected people, or what you would maybe call like not out group, but people who are not within the culture. Whereas I think for medicine plant knowledge, it's more close, the sharing of.
Cool. All right. Thanks for that.
Thanks for the question.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Deniz. This was amazing. And I look forward to us having a chat about all of this later.
Yeah, me too. Thank you very much for inviting me. I really enjoyed our discussion.
Awesome. All right. Take care, everybody, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.